C.S. Friedman is the queen of Westworld-like twists, peppered throughout each story, that build toward a conclusion. She doesn't always stick the landing, but her mastery of storytelling is as clear as her most understated yet powerful payoffs. Her premises take common concepts or story tropes and reinvent them with oh my god sci-fi foundations, and world building that makes these things believable and credible. Just one tiny thing were added to what we know. Her novels won acclaim with readers as well as critics. The books hit bestseller lists. They won awards. They expanded a culture of fantasy fiction whose magic depends as much on rules as miracles. They demonstrated how often good fantasy is just good science fiction. C.S. Friedman's books did what so few books ever do. They endured. What's more, her career seemed positioned to do what so few others do in publishing. C.S. Friedman seemed positioned to thrive. And yet, at the peak of her success, it felt like the author dropped off a cliff. From the early 2000s, her output shrank. She broke her promise to never write a sequel. The welding is good, and readers were left wondering whether this was a tragic ending, or merely the author's dark night of the soul, preempting the brightest moments of dawn. But you wouldn't stop yet. You'd remember the now iconic wisdom that every magic trick includes a third part, a final act, a prestige. A simple working will draw enough fade together for us to open the windows of time, space, and reality. A mental lock, a whispered phrase, a touch of willpower is all it takes. But the fate isn't strong enough, not yet. We have to wait until... There it is. Not enough for a healing, but enough for a seeing. Enough to see what brought this powerhouse author to such a low state, and how she recently emerged more powerful than ever. If you lived through the 70s, you knew that the 80s would be a time of wonder. A time of bold new visions in all forms of media. Sci-fi became king, fantasy became queen, horror subverted all assumptions of the gender binary, and the future magister of the sci-fi fantasy genres understood that to master one side required an author to master the other. Good fantasy, an author would one day say, is just good sci-fi. There must be rules and consequences. That author is Celia S. Friedman, also known as C.S. Friedman. She was part of the suite of 80s and 90s women of sci-fi fantasy that became synonymous with DAW Publishing. Acquired by Astra Publishing in 2022, DAW is led by the esteemed Betsy Walheim and Sheila E. Gilbert. The publisher remains a powerhouse for sci-fi fantasy authors and readers. You may remember DAW's other prominent authors who rose to fame and are still considered titans of the sci-fi fantasy genres. These authors include Marion Zimmer Bradley, Kate Elliott, Tanya Huff, Mercedes Lackey, and Kathleen O'Neill Gear. Oh yeah, and they gave Patrick Rothfuss a shot with his debut novel, The Name of the Wind, in 2007. You'll notice that a lot of these ladies used androgynous pseudonyms, including C.S. Friedman. Speaking to Fantasy Cafe in 2014, Celia explained, "The odds were good that any name with initials represented a woman, and everyone knew that, but it left the matter nebulous enough that maybe a male reader would take your book down on the shelf and look at it, rather than just dismissing it out of hand." Later, speaking to Grimdark magazine in 2020, Celia further explained why she followed that path in the earliest days of her publishing journey. Julia Fraser asked, "Can you speak to your experiences as a woman author in the often male-dominated sci-fi fantasy world? What advice would you give to female writers?" And C.S. Friedman answered, "When I started writing, the majority of sci-fi fantasy readers were males, as were the writers. Many readers believed that women could not write, quote-unquote, real science fiction, and some males would not purchase a sci-fi book by a female writer. So many female writers in that time period went by their initials, and a couple used male pen names. One dull writer used two pen names, a female one to write science fiction focused on social elements, and a male one to write rock'em sock'em military sci-fi. End quote. Well, that's a little light on inclusive language for non-binary people, but reading Friedman's work shows that's just a limitation of the language. Her fiction equally explores the limits of the galaxy as much as it does the malleability and fluidity of gender, orientation, and the bodies to which they are attached. As of 2022, C.S. Friedman has published 14 novels, among them her debut In Conquest Born and its sequel The Wilding, as well as This Alien Shore, a New York Times Notable Book of the Year in 1998, and the Cold Fire Trilogy, a finalist for NPR's Science Fiction and Fantasy Vote. C.S. Friedman's premises take common concepts or story tropes and reinvent them with, oh my god, sci-fi foundations and world building that make these things believable and credible if just one tiny thing were added to what we know. For example, in her Cold Fire Trilogy, she explained how if magic existed, it would be a natural force governed by consistent rules. Quote, like fire, it should be useful when controlled, dangerous if uncontrolled, she said. The fact that we build windmills does not mean we stop fearing hurricanes, end quote. I think of everything you loved about shows like Lost and Westworld, now in those stories with stunning conclusions that feel surprising, yet inevitable. Years later, she wrote This Alien Shore, one of the earliest, for me, most realistic at the time, and most powerful representations, we've come a long way since then, of dissociative identity disorder via its teenage main character. That character's condition isn't caused by their implants, but those implants do give a concrete visual aid for readers to connect with an embodied condition that is just as real in our world today as it is in imagined sci-fi fantasy stories.
Something else that has always impressed me about Celia's writings is the breadth of them. She is not a one-trick pony, right? She has got multiple different sagas set in multiple different realities, and they're all well-developed. The characters within them are all well-developed and unique. The aliens and the cultures within them are all well-developed and unique. She is not content to simply have created one broad spanning reality and explored in depth. She's created many. She does it a little bit in the Madness season, although it goes the other direction, right? It starts as science fiction, then it ends up with a little bit of fantasy, and the fact that our main character is a mythical creature. What do I like about C.S. Friedman? There's one notable thing. Celia, when she writes an alien, she writes an alien. When she writes a different culture, she writes a different culture. And I love this. This is something that's lacking in so much science fiction and so much fantasy. Star Trek is a great example of doing this poorly, right? You glue a couple of prosthetics onto a person's forehead, you give them an accent, and voila, it's supposed to be an alien culture. It's just a person. It's a completely identifiable person with completely identifiable motives. When Celia writes an alien, she writes an alien. The motives are hard to fathom because they're not human motives. We don't understand what's making this character do what it's doing. The culture is hard to interpret because it's not a human culture. Or if it is a human culture, it's an offbeat human culture, unfamiliar to us. So you actually have to think about, why is this person doing this? Why is this creature doing this? Why is it acting like it is? Why are the priorities it has the priorities that it has? It's something that is missing, like I said, in so much mainstream fiction, and it's just really something I cherish about her works. I have a thing about wounded characters. I love wounded characters, and I couldn't really tell you why. Maybe I consider myself a wounded character. At some level, we are all wounded characters, and wounded characters make for fascinating stories. I just think that Celia handles the wounded characters well, and she does a good job of evolving their behavior based on the wounds. My own background includes a fair bit of theater, technical theater, and I actually met my wife in a theater program. So in a way, I feel a certain kinship with Celia. We've never met. I'm a huge fan of her works, but knowing that she got her start studying costume design and theater and participating in the STA, I feel like these are bonds between us. She's completely unaware of this, of course, but I feel a kinship with her.
C.S. Friedman's career, of course, couldn't have happened without her birth. And look at that. There's just enough faith for a deeper working. What it requires of us is focus, concentration, and focus.
In 1957, Celia S. Friedman, or C.S. Friedman, was born to Nancy and Herbert Friedman. Her childhood was filled by the sound of her father at a typewriter churning out magazine articles. In 1969, at age 12, during a trip to France with her family, Celia ran out of reading material and purchased the only book available in English, Asimov's collection, Earth is Room Enough, and she fell in love with science fiction. In 1970, at age 13, she wrote a vampire novel, mostly between the pages of her math notebook. This was back in the Dark Shadows generation, when writing a vampire novel was more or less a requirement for growing up. In 1971, at age 14, she began designing an interstellar universe, complete with warring nations and a 10,000-year history. This would later become the core background material for her first published novel, In Conquest Born. In 1974, at age 17, Celia shipped out to Brandeis University, where she studied math for 1 year before changing to theater. She discovered the Society for Creative Anachronism, or the SCA, and the joy of spending her weekends in period costume. In 1976, when she was 19, Celia transferred to Adelphi University, where she followed her mother's suggestion to not just imagine and wear costumes, but to make them as a costume designer. For fun, she joined the League of Renaissance Swordsmen, where she met Rick Umbaugh, who read her stuff and said she should finish it and submit it to a publisher. In 1978, Celia attended the University of Georgia, UGA, where she got her Master of Fine Arts degree in costume design, and finally began finishing the novel that would become her debut, In Conquest Born. In 1981, Celia got her first job as an assistant professor of costuming in Geneseo, New York. Not a lot of focused writing, but there were a lot of fevered short stories to express the tension, when suddenly those short stories merged into her first published novel. During 1983, in her website bio, Celia writes that she had spent the whole night in a writing frenzy, turning out 30 pages that, in hindsight, were clearly inspired by the bitterly cold, ice-bound Rochester winter. She looked at them in the bleary light of dawn, read them again, and thought, "Damn, this is good. This is good enough to sell." Those pages survived the long journey to publication and now exist as Chapter 11 of In Conquest Born.
In the comments section of an interview for Blackgate posted on May 2nd, 2023, C.S. Friedman expanded on that moment by responding to a fan question. She said, "Unlike most, possibly all other writers, I never planned to be published or particularly desired it. I just wrote for my own pleasure. One freezing cold night when I lived in the snowbelt, when the world was shrouded in snow and I was recovering from a very stressful workday, I sat down and started writing a story set on a frozen planet. I got caught up in it and just kept writing until I realized dawn was coming. I'd written 30 pages. As I reread my work and realized how powerful the story was and how good the writing was, I thought, this is publishable quality. I could start publishing my work if I wanted."
In April of 1986, under the stewardship of Betsy Wollheim, the editor goddess for Daw Books, C.S. Friedman's debut novel, In Conquest Born, was published.
In Conquest Born. The great war between Braxai and Isaiah has gone on since the beginning of interstellar history, and will continue, some claim, to its end. Unable to achieve final victory, unwilling to accept defeat, both sides have devoted centuries to perfecting their martial capacity, each according to a unique tradition. In the Braxian holding, the ruling Braxana tribe draws upon ancient customs to create a warrior race as strong as it is ruthless and utterly without human weakness. In the Asian Empire, scientists race to perfect the human genome and unleash the psychic potential of the human mind against their implacable opponent. Now, two great generals have risen, each determined to break the stalemate at any cost, and their obsession will soon spark a vendetta that will change the course of empires.
The novel was nominated for the Astounding Award for Best New Writer. This used to be called the John W. Campbell Award, but they changed that in 2020. Complete sidebar here. A lot of the novelists I like from days gone by turn out to be not the best humans. Not that that applies to Celia in any way. In the 1990s, she signs with agent Russ Galen, who Celia says gets credit as well for all the things that agents do best, including artistic inspiration. In September of 1990, she publishes The Madness Season.
The Madness Season. For hundreds of years, Earth has suffered under the yoke of alien conquerors, the dreaded Tyr, a reptilian race in which all individuality is submerged into a single, overarching consciousness. Determined to keep humanity cowed, the Tyr have culled from a captive population the most intelligent, the most curious, and the most likely to inspire rebellion, and banished them from Earth. As the memory of freedom recedes, humanity sinks into a lethargic subservience. Datrin, the hero of this tale, is a vampire, not a monster, however, but a man, nearly immortal, who embodies the vanished virtues of the once sovereign Earth. When his existence is exposed by the Tyr, who are appalled to find a human who witnessed the conquest, they immediately ship him off-world. Thus begins a journey of self-discovery, as Datrin is forced by adversity to come to grips with the long-suppressed side of his nature and confront the ancient horror of a bloody heritage.
Paul Schaefer, longtime fan and moderator of author-sanctioned fan site Marintha.org, said that C.S. Friedman's indelible storytelling style was on full display in her second novel, The Madness Season, saying, quote, she has a penchant and skill for indirect writing. This is where a chapter outwardly written about a minor character is really meant to provide, through an indirect view, insights into a major character's behavior or background, and thus his motivations. The second chapter of The Madness Season not only introduces us to Mara, but also depicts the Tyr from a second point of view, completely different from that of Datrin. By examining a subject from multiple vantage points, we get a greater insight into that subject than if told strictly from first person.
Between October 1991 and October 1995, C.S. Friedman publishes her acclaimed Coldfire trilogy, consisting of the three books Black Sun Rising, When True Night Falls, and Crown of Shadows.
The Coldfire Trilogy. The main events of the trilogy take place on the fictional planet of Urna, colonized 1,200 years before the start of the books by a group of humans from a future Earth. Urna is a primarily hospitable environment. Although a planet with severe and intense seismic activity, the planet is similar enough to Earth to allow for habitability. It has, however, another key difference from Earth. The entire surface of Urna is wrapped in a powerful energy field known as the Fae. The energy is also sensitive to the human psyche, as the colonists discover to their dismay. The Fae reacts to the human cerebral activity, bringing to life dreams and manifesting fears. For a few hundred years, humanity has managed to eke out a scant existence on the harsh surface of Urna, keeping an uneasy balance with the Fae. Mankind grows wary of its tumultuous battle with the energy force, however, and multiple organizations try to find ways to render the human psyche unable to mold the Fae. One organization is the Church of Human Unification. If a single person's thoughts can affect the Fae like magic, they believe unifying humans' intentions will have an exponential power capable of saving them. As one character says, if God does not exist, then the Fae will make him real. The trilogy focuses on two men who begin as absolute enemies but must unite to conquer an evil greater than anything their world has ever known. One is a warrior priest ready to sacrifice anything and everything for the cause of humanity's progress. The other is a sorcerer who has survived for countless centuries by total submission to evil. In their joint quest, both will be irreversibly changed. The audiobooks feature an incredible performance by R.C. Bray. Nightborn, a prequel novel. If you're a fan of Coldfire, you're in luck. The original trilogy came out in the 90s, but C.S. Friedman has returned to the Coldfire series with the prequel novel Nightborn, which expands on some of the most compellingly teased moments of the prologue of When True Night Falls. The story is about the early planetary settlers who arrive on a seemingly hospitable planet, only to discover that it harbors a terrifying secret. Soon, the settlers find themselves caught up in a desperate battle for survival against the Fae, a natural force with the power to prey upon the human mind itself, bringing a person's greatest fears and darkest nightmares to life. Actual Fae. In the real world, we haven't yet discovered Erna, but Celia recently let the world know that if we look at the beauty of the bioluminescent water, we can see what she imagines the Fae would look like in the real world.
The book, though, I guess the reason I think you would enjoy it is because it is an interesting look at what happens if humans end up on a planet that interacts in a weird way with our physiology, essentially. And that's an interesting idea because you could basically get a fantasy experience with real people, humans, just on a different planet because of the way that the solar system or whatever interacts with you in ways that we might not expect because we've never been to those planets.
Right, so you get magic through a sci-fi lens. That's always fun. Dragon
it was
Riders
just
of
very
Pern style.
I've never read that or heard of
Really?
it. It may be a movie. I don't know about it.
No, it's a very famous book series. It's the concept of dragon riding was invented for this book series that came out in the 70s.
So, well, I'm not like a huge fan of like dragon-based fantasy, but cool.
Something that I like as a reader is when you start a novel or a series that is a fantasy, and then it turns out it was science fiction. Or you can go the other direction, something that starts as science fiction and then turns out to be fantasy. And C.S. Friedman has done a couple of these. The Coldfire trilogy in particular comes to mind with this. It starts out as what's clearly a fantasy novel, a fantasy series, and then we get well into it and discover, oh, it was science fiction. Little did I know. And in that, she reminds me of Anne McCaffrey with the Dragon Riders of Pern. Right, we get through the entire first trilogy and I believe the second trilogy before we discover that this world has a science fiction base. In August of 1998, she publishes This Alien Shore, at the time a standalone novel, but what would eventually become the first in the Outworld series.
This Alien Shore. In This Alien Shore, it is the second stage of human colonization. The first age, humanity's initial attempt to people the stars, ended in disaster when it was discovered that Earth's original superluminal drive did permeate genetic damage to all who used it, mutating Earth's far-flung colonists in mind and body. Now, one of Earth's first colonies has given humanity back the stars, but at a high price, a monopoly over all human commerce. And when a satellite in Earth's outer orbit is viciously attacked by corporate raiders, an unusual young woman flees to a ship bound for the up and out. But her narrow escape does not mean safety. For speeding across the galaxy, pursued by ruthless but unknown adversaries, this young woman will discover a secret which is buried deep inside her mind, a revelation the universe may not be ready to face.
Between January 2007 and August 2011, she publishes the Magister trilogy, consisting of the 3 books, Feast of Souls, Rings of Wrath, and Legacy of Kings.
The Magister trilogy. At the end of her best-selling Coldfire trilogy, C.S. Friedman challenged readers to imagine what a world would be like if sorcery required the ultimate sacrifice, that of life itself. Now, in a groundbreaking new trilogy, she introduces us to a terrifying new world in which the cost of magic is just that. A world in which the fuel for sorcery is the very fire of the human spirit, and those who hunger for magical power must pay for it with their lives. In this epic tale of terrifying shadows and desperate hope, the greatest threat of all may be that of ancient enemies returned, or ancient wars resumed, but of the darkness that lies within the human hearts of men.
But, of course, not everything goes according to plan, and Celia found out at the end of the Magister trilogy, perhaps her only true fantasy series, what kind of obstacles a storyteller faces if they don't anticipate the rules that can break their imagined world.
The total ramifications of an almost unlimited power of magic totally screwed me on so many counts. I mean, you'll note through the trilogy, almost everything major takes place in some place where like magic doesn't work totally. I thought there were controls. I thought when I set up the system there were controls, there were reasons they weren't doing certain things. They weren't like reasons I trust you not to want to, but real solid reasons why. But I found as the book went on it wasn't enough. And I did have problems with there being more power in the hands of some characters than there should have been, and I had to fight with that.
And here is where we reach the opening moments of this documentary. I worked in publishing, mostly during the 00s and the 2010s. That new perspective behind the scenes provoked a new immersion for me in C.S. Friedman's works. My awareness expanded beyond the simple act of reading that had first brought me to Celia's novels in the 90s. In the midst of graduate school at University of Georgia, I became an acquiring and developmental editor, shepherding my own authors to awards and bestseller lists. I developed a deeper appreciation and interest in the person behind C.S. Friedman's books. I discovered, like many others of her fans, that while Celia was still writing, she stopped writing as much or as often. She broke her vow to never write a sequel, hence the wilding. None of those things are in themselves wrong or bad or even red flags, but something did feel off. The problem? There simply wasn't enough fate worth knowing. People change, so do authors. There are, after all, people too, except for ChatGPT, of course. The challenge she faced was one not even her most indelible characters could conquer. The colonists of Erna first meeting the manifested figures of their nightmares. C.S. Friedman now faced the specter of death.
In 2011, in anticipation of the conclusion to her acclaimed Magister trilogy, Celia S. Friedman delivers a rare public interview.
I took a kind of, my mother died for a while, and it kind of threw me off my kilter. And I took a sort of, people talked me into trying to write a sequel, which I'd sworn for years I wouldn't do, and it really screwed up my writing break for a while. And the combination of mother dying and not wanting to write a sequel was really bad. But I'm not writing sequels anymore, and my mother can't die again, so we're pretty good.
Between February 2014 and December 2016, she publishes the Dreamwalker trilogy, consisting of 3 young adult books: Dreamwalker, Dreamseeker, and Dreamweaver.
Dreamwalker Trilogy. The first book in the action-filled urban fantasy Dreamwalker trilogy follows Jessica Drake as she navigates the dangerous landscape of distant worlds and dimensions. All her life, Jessica Drake has dreamed of other worlds, some of them similar to her own, others disturbingly alien. She never shares the detail with anyone, save her younger brother Tommy, a compulsive gamer who incorporates some aspects of Jessica's dreams into his games. But now someone is asking about those dreams, and about her. A strange woman has been watching her house. A visitor to her school attempts to take possession of her dream-inspired artwork. As she begins to search for answers, it becomes clear that whoever is watching her does not want her to learn the truth. One night, her house catches fire, and when the smoke clears, she discovers that her brother has been kidnapped. She must figure out what's going on, and quickly, if she and her family are to be safe. Following clues left behind on Tommy's computer, determined to find her brother and bring him home safely, Jessica and 2 of her friends are about to embark on a journey that will test their spirits and their courage to the breaking point, as they must leave their own world behind and confront the source of Earth's darkest legends, as well as the terrifying truth of their own secret heritage.
In November 2020, she publishes This Virtual Night, the long-awaited but totally unexpected sequel to This Alien Shore, and the next book in the Outworld series.
This Virtual Night. Just as with the sequel to In Conquest Born, Celia Friedman waited for the right story to write a sequel for This Alien Shore. But years later, she has delivered the stunning sequel, This Virtual Night. When deep space travel altered the genes of the first interstellar colonists, Earth abandoned them, but some of the colonies survived, and a new civilization of mental and physical variance has been established, centered around clusters of space stations known as the Outworlds. Now, the unthinkable has happened. A suicide assault has destroyed the life support system of a major way station. All that is known about the young men responsible is that in their last living moments, they were receiving messages from an uninhabited sector of space and were playing a virtual reality game. Two unlikely allies have joined forces to investigate the incident. Rue Gaia, a mercenary explorer with a taste for high-risk ventures, and a game designer, Micaiah Bello, who forces the parties responsible for the attack in order to clear his name. From the corridors of the derelict station lost to madness to an outlaw stronghold in the depths of uncharted space, the two now follow the trail of an enemy who can twist human minds to his purpose and whose plans could bring about the collapse of Outworld civilization.
And here we discover that with her return has come an abundance of fae. Is it science? Is it magic? As Friedman so often demonstrates in the best fiction, there often is no difference.
I prefer science fiction, and it's my choice, and I probably would have spent an entire life writing it. Except that, to be honest with you, the monetary difference is immense. Yeah, immense. It's like, my publisher says it's like 4 and 5 times.
Yeah, Coldfire was my introduction to Celia. I had never read any C.S. Friedman before that. And my husband, Jordan, who also co-hosts iWizard with me, he's a high school English teacher, and he teaches like sci-fi and fantasy course.
Oh, yeah.
And so one of the assigned readings that he gave his students was Black Sun Rising.
That's amazing.
And he hadn't...
That's amazing.
Yeah. And he hadn't read it before either. And so his students were super into it. And he just got to a point where he's like, you have to read this. You're going to love this book. It's going to be one of your favorites. Just like, please read it with me. And I blew through it. And it just was absolutely gorgeous. Yeah. And I love the world that she creates and her magic system with the Fae, and how the novel is like, it's fantasy, but it starts from a place of science fiction. So for me, I've always been a lover of sci-fi and fantasy, but I've always tended a little bit more towards fantasy, especially as of late, because I am a scientist. My background is in science and engineering. I have my PhD. So I don't like to necessarily read science fiction for fun always, because it's like, all right, I read technical papers all day and teach, and it's like I want to get a little bit away from that usually when I'm reading fiction. And so I tend a little bit more towards fantasy, just to escape, get into the magic. And I love just like beautiful environments that are created. So with Coldfire and Celia, it is genre bending in that, yeah, you do have fantasy with this moderate magic system that has rules to it, but the rules aren't laid out such that it's like super sciencey. Like if you read Brandon Sanderson, for example, he has very hard magic systems in that there are clear rules. There are appendices at the end of the books. And so that you could try to guess like how the characters are going to use the magic. And it sometimes feels like you're in a RPG, like a role-playing game, like a video game.
Yes.
Whereas Celia has a little bit more mystery to her magic system, but it comes from a place of science, actually, because she's thinking about energy and like what are the different like sources of energy to Erna. And like she practices the conservation of energy in her magic, right? So she has the solar fae, which comes from the sun. She has the earth fae that comes from Erna's geothermal heat.
Yes.
And so like all the tectonic activity and such. She has the dark fae, which come out in the absence of light, which you can kind of think of like antimatter in a sense almost, or dark matter.
Yes.
Except that it's like more energy. And then she also has the tidal fae, which is the force of gravity. And I love the tidal fae because she has these humanoid creatures that are native to Erna called the Racks.
Yes.
And only the female Racks can harness the tidal fae, and only when they're pre-menopause, right? That they kind of lose it after they go through menopause. So it's a very much like instinctual kind of way to access this part of this kind of magic, right? And so I love that she has all these different genres piled in. So she has her fantasy magic and like this whole new world, but it comes from scientific or sci-fi roots where like people came from Earth to inhabit Erna. And then there's also a horror element in that, because people have these fears, their fears manifest on Erna. That's what the Fae does. Okay. It's so your biggest, anything that like draws some kind of big emotion, right? Whether it's fear, whether it's desire, anything that's a strong emotion can be manifested. And so we get vampires, we get demons that inhabit Erna because of the human imagination. And so that's really cool as well. And so I don't like putting like fantasy and sci-fi into all these little boxes because like, right, there's like epic fantasy and like there's all these different like subgenres of fantasy. And so like if I was going to put Coldfire in one genre, it would be more fantasy, I'd say, than anything else, even though it touches on horror, even though it comes from science fiction, whereas Nightborn is more science fiction, even though it has horror elements and magic elements. And so I think that she does describe Coldfire as her masterpiece. And I really do see it as such. It is a masterpiece. And I'm just hoping that the younger generation picks up on and gets into this trilogy. Like a great entryway, I really think, is Nightborn would make a fantastic movie that maybe could suck some people in and like get them into Coldfire. Like it really, really would.
Yes.
So, and it's the right length for it. And it's like from the right scope because there's different characters you kind of jump in and out of to tell the story. And it's not like all these asides. I think it would make a very compelling, like regular feature length film. With Nightborn, you find out how like dystopian basically Earth has become because it's polluted, it's overpopulated, right? And so that's where a lot of science fiction stems from, right? Humans looking for the new frontier. Yeah, and when I picked up Black Sun Rising, I had no idea really what it was about. So Jordan teaches high school, and he was teaching Black Sun Rising in his sci-fi and fantasy lit course. And he was reading it for the first time too, along with the students. And he's just like, you have to read this. You'll love this. Just read it. And he wouldn't even tell me what it was about. He'd give me nothing. And so I read the first chapter, and I got the first POV. I'm like, oh, this is nice. And then I got to the end of that chapter, and I'm like, okay. Did not see that coming. Here we go. I just absolutely love the world that you created. Erna is just this beautiful, magical place. So you want to talk a little bit about where your idea came from in developing the world?
You know, I can't tell you where it came from, but I can tell you how it came, which is that I had the concept for the characters a long time before I wrote the book. It could have been my second book. And I thought, you know, I'm not writing the story until I have a magic system and a world that is worthy of it.
Mhm.
So I don't know where it came from, but I will tell you there was about 3 years of playing with it in the back of my mind. And I'm a very scientific fantasy person. Even with fantasy, I like when it follows natural law and you get the feeling that the magic could be a real thing.
Right,
And
right.
so from there, it was a pretty straightforward step to the concept that, well, there is magic. It's a natural force. It's actually a scientific force. We just don't understand it. It looks like magic. And then from there, it's like, okay, what could it do? It has to follow the laws of thermodynamics, conservation of energy, and fuel has to equal output, so it has to come from somewhere. It has to be expendable in some form, shape, or manner. How do we control it? And I think my inspiration for the Fae was really California wildfires that year, because I was watching them and I was thinking, well, this is what a natural force does. It Fire is probably what kicked off the whole evolution into the modern human being.
Mhm.
That gave us cooking, that gave us safety, and everything else followed from there. But when it's out of control, it is completely and absolutely destructive. I wanted the same thing. I thought wind is the same way. We have terrible hurricanes and tornadoes, but obviously the movement of air is important. Water, we have to have it, but we have floods and monsoons. Everything that is in nature, we have learned how to channel it, but we have never learned how to control it. So the more I worked with it, the more I wanted it to fit into natural law. And I think that's part of what people have responded to. My question was, if magic existed, what would it look like and how would it work? And that
And
was
I
a
love that you have this, it's almost a hard magic system in that there are like fundamental rules, but you don't cram it down into your readers. Like you give them enough to figure it out, but you never explain it.
well, and you never figure it all out. That's
Exactly. Yeah.
That was one of the challenges with Nightborn. If I can jump a little,
Yeah.
Nightborn expands upon an incident that's mentioned in the prologue to the second book, which is the founding of Erna, and the actions. I'm trying for no spoilers here, and the actions that cause the most of the Earth technology to be destroyed, so that not only wasn't it working really well, it wasn't there. And it's that series of events, but it's mostly about the desperation of the colonists who showed up on this planet. They don't have a depth yet, so no one can see this stuff. There's nothing like it on Earth, so they're not going to think it's there. All they know is they are on the planet where weird things are happening, and they seem to be responding to psychic images that particular person has, but not necessarily what they're thinking at that moment.
Mhm.
And that's all they know. And this is the generation that has to figure out enough about the Fae to figure out how to control it enough to survive. And that's what Nightborn really is. It's a bunch of science-minded people dumped in the middle of what appears to be a magical system. Deep inside, they know it's not a magical system because magic does not exist and everything must be scientifically explainable.
Right.
But oh my God, invisible forces are creating monsters. How do I make those two things work together? And so that's what's happening. It's responding to people mentally, but it's responding randomly. And
Okay.
some of them it's giving them what they fear, some of them it's giving them what they want. But at this point in the story, they have no control over it. By the time of the trilogy, some people have control over it. And what they have gained control over is how to emanate the thing that they want the fate to reflect, and only that. So that's the struggle and the really interesting part of Nightborn for me, on top of the fact that they're panicking and they'll all die if they don't figure it out. So it's a really tense book. And for the first time, you're getting people who are growing up with this weird light show and strange powers. And I'm trying to decide now how late in life that happens. Because otherwise you run into a Twilight Zone thing of this little immature kid with tremendous power. So the age at which you learn to control the Fae is like absolutely pivotal to this planet. If you go look up bioluminescence,
Mm-hmm.
that's the color. And that's really the look of it. I wanted it washing across the earth like water, and it has currents and it has directions and it has tides. And there are times it flows more strongly than others.
Yeah, I love that.
So it's really, and you have to know what direction to work in. It may be that malevolent magic works better in one direction and benevolent magic works better in another. because that thread of the Fae happens to be heading off in that direction in that area. So really, you would a sorcerer would like have Fae maps, knowing where everything was in the area. So and then about a couple of months ago, I saw my first video of bioluminescent beaches, which is where the water washes up and the algae that's in it begins to glow, and it's exactly that blue.
And so with Tarrant, then you had mentioned that your idea for the characters came even before the magic system. And I had read as part of your biography that you were writing vampire novels as a teenager. So is that like with did the idea for Terrence start then or a little later?
It's a combination of two things. I was actually reading something about the Jesuits, and I was reading that as part of their research, they often studied things that normally the church didn't want worshippers studying, forbidden subjects, if you will, because they needed to understand them, and it was part of their intellectual duty to understand things like that. So suddenly I had this image of someone who was part of this very restrictive church, wanted knowledge, was in that gray area where there was something special about him that allowed him to seek out that knowledge, but it was still forbidden knowledge. You know what I mean? It's like walking that fine edge of what's allowed, what's okay, what's going to work. And that is, of course, the balancing act that he does his whole life and ultimately falls off the tripwire, falls off the high wire. Doesn't keep the balance, goes over to one side. And so that was the human part of it. Recently, I was rereading a book by Tanith Lee called Knight's Master, which I consider one of the greatest fantasy books ever written. And she is one of my primary inspirations for writing style. Her stuff is so beautiful and emotive. I mean, the sentences are so gorgeous. And I had forgotten Knight's Master. And it's kind of the ultimate anti-hero book in the way that mine is, where the anti-hero isn't like evil so much as amoral, without any morals. The hero of that book is a demon who basically does not care for humankind at all. We're here for his amusement. He doesn't have any emotions that we can relate to. He does some phenomenally cruel things just offhand, just doesn't care. And yet he's fascinating. And there is, among other things, that elegant darkness, that sense of political power and sophistication in the demon world. And I realize now how much that book inspired Gerald Tarrant.
So did the idea for Damien come before or after Tarrant? How did you decide to create Damien?
Damien was actually kind of inspired by a friend of mine. I almost nothing that I write is ever inspired by real people. But he was a kind of heavy-set guy, strong but kind of jovial, a little bit on the sarcastic side. And it was just that mix of qualities that I really liked. So, and that was when he was gaming and could make characters that just, just express that freely.
Yeah.
And I just like that. It seemed to work for me, and it seemed like such a good foil for Tarrant, which is really what Damien is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so on that note, are there any other works, whether it's literature or TV or movies, that have inspired you?
For this Alien, sure, I acknowledged the writings of Cordwainer Smith. I actually stole a few ideas outright. They're very different in my book, but I love the concept that whatever hyperspace is that lets you go faster than light, that there would be predators in that universe that wanted to eat people. I mean, that was just, and that's, I think, from his story, The Game of Rat and Dragon, where people are mind melding with house cats to kill massive, invisible, dragon-like creatures in hyperspace. He was the most bizarre imagination ever. So I stole that and some terminology, and I acknowledged him. But for that one, most of the inspiration came from nonfiction reading, in particular Oliver Sacks. You must read Anthropologist on Mars. It's his best. And a lot of This Alien Shore was inspired by it. And you can see it as you read it, that the characters came from that. He investigates various mental, what we call disabilities. Obviously, they're not in the book, and tries to get into the mindset of what's happening and how it affects their thinking, and looks for the fact that there might be positive aspects to it. He's looking for the big picture, not just like, well, Tourette's has these problems. How do they get around it? But one of the people he interviews is actually a surgeon with Tourette's, which is probably the last profession you would expect someone with Tourette's.
Right, because you have to be in total control of your fine motor skills.
So he interviews the guy and talks to him about how that works. He was one of the very first ones to interview Temple Grandin, who was one of the first autistic adults to talk about her experience and her internal reality in terms that others could understand. So Anthropologist on Mars has a series of chapters in which basically each one takes a mental disability and explores the reality of it and how it affects the person and what the possible positive side effects are. And that's the theme of this Alien Shore, that you have one people where neural development doesn't always function in a totally reliable way. So they have these conditions in their society, lots and lots of people with lots and lots of things that are not neurotypical. And they have learned to accept them and absorb them and exploit each one for what it does best, so that they are points of pride and constructive creativity rather than something they resent and try to get around. I want to put you in the head of someone who doesn't think like you would expect a normal human to think. Whether that is an alien, whether that is a human who has mutated to adapt to a planet and is no longer neurotypical, whether it's somebody who's seeing power every minute of the day, whether it's somebody who's trying to perform science experiments on a world where you can't perform science experiments, basically. When you get into very complicated magic or technology, we do tend to personify it. And you do tend to say, well, I mean, as it says on the little bookmark that I made for the Nightborn, it says, what do you do when the planet that you want to live on wants to kill you?
Right. And
Nothing
the idea of
wants to
Gaia.
kill them. Yeah, there's nothing positive or negative. There's no consciousness, absolutely nothing. It's just a disembodied force. But when you look at the effect, we tend to imagine a Gaia force like this is the whole planet in a kind of, what was that 3D movie whose name I'm forgetting?
Avatar?
Avatar came out around the time this was getting to be big. And, you know, they actually physically hooked up to the planet.
Yeah, they have some stuff in Avatar that looks like the Fae.
These are all kind of common visions. And actually, one of the characters in Nightborn, one of her theses in school when she studied it and that she teaches, is that there are symbols that we absorb without knowing it. Whether or not you believe those symbols, you know what they are. And your mind will recognize what they are, even if you've never consciously studied them. No one's ever actually taught them to you. Things like blue is connected to electricity because when we turn on the electrical components, that is the color of the display when we first started. Little things like that, and we don't think about them, but later on the color has that significance to everybody.
Right. And so when you're putting together your books, George R. R. Martin says that there are two types of writers. There are architects and there are gardeners. So which one are you?
Well, first of all, I'm in between. I think that that's also the pants versus planner.
Right.
By the seat of your pants versus planning. I can't plan beyond a certain point. Usually I have about 10 chapters ahead. Then I have some of the major ideas for the next section. And then I have kind of vague ideas and an ending. And as I write, I get more and more. So, excuse me. So I guess I'm a little more scattered, but I wish I weren't, and I'm trying really hard because it's so much easier to write with an outline. I mean, I can't believe it. The few times I've had one, it was so easy. You know, you sit down, you know what you have to write. There it is. There's the assignment for today. Finish this. Here's the scene. Go do it. I'm trying not to get really awkward as I head towards the end I want. You know, it can't feel artificial. But on the other hand, everything has to head in that direction. I will tell you a great story. My favorite anecdote. I'm doing a panel, and all the other writers on the panel are fantasy writers, and we're in a library. And somebody asks about the writing process. And the first woman tells a story how she's writing a book and she couldn't get the scene to work. There was a battle scene and she could not get it to work. And she tried and tried and tried, and it just would not work. And then one night she's lying asleep and her character comes to her. And everybody next to her is going, yeah, yeah, yeah. And I'm going, the character comes to her and she says, look, I need you to participate in this battle scene. And he says, I don't want to be in a battle scene. He says, I don't want to fight. And she says, okay, what do you want to do? And he says, I want to party. So she changed the whole ending of her book so that it would end in this big party, to which my writer sense says, how good could the ending have been if you could throw it out that easily? You know, how important was the ending if you could just chop it off?
Right.
And they go down the line, and every single person is talking about how the characters talk to them and have conferences with them, and the plot tells them where it needs to go, and they interact with it. And they get to me, and I just sat there. I looked at the audience for a second. I said, if I ever had a character come to me and tell me that he was not going to participate in the climactic scene of the book, I would kill him.
I don't doubt it.
You don't have that option.
You are not gentle on your characters.
No, I'm not. And I create them. I don't talk to them.
Yeah.
I don't experience them, except in a kind of intellectual sense. To me, it's much more like creating a perfect sculpture.
Well, as you sculpt and chisel away at your characters, like how many times do you go through your book once it's done to really, really sculpt them? Or do they just come out?
I do it little by little. So what I'll do is when I sit down to work, I'll go over the few chapters right before what I'm doing, and I'll refine them and I'll polish them. And that like gives me a running start and some momentum into the part I haven't written yet. So the editing is, as I go along, is kind of a vital part of getting the whole thing done. So it's rare there's going to be something that I haven't polished a lot. I don't usually go back and change the whole thing. I'm usually planned enough and controlled enough that the book overall is doing what I want.
Yeah.
You know, but you know, if the ending of a book is not satisfying, then the whole book isn't satisfying. You've got to have that punch at the end where it wraps things up and it gives you an emotional thrill. And if you just kind of wander through it waiting to see where it goes, I mean, my objection to that is that if I'm just waiting to see where the story goes, well, the reader can do that too. I'm not going to surprise the reader by going, oh, here's a scene. Yeah, that would lead to this. I have to craft something where you think that would lead to this, and actually it leads somewhere else.
Yeah.
So to some degree, anything that you would guess would happen, I can't use. I have half a dozen people who have been my beta readers for a long time, and I think they are very important for any writer, no matter how professional you get. And I chose them all because they give me really, really good criticism. So I can send them a chapter and I can say, okay, the character's about to do something he shouldn't do. Have I justified it? Because my pet hatred, my big pet peeve in fiction is when people do things stupidly to make the plot go forward. It does scare me when people tell me that my books help get them through dark times, though, because the books are so dark. You know, that every time somebody says that, I'm like,
Yes.
I know that often I'm connecting with people who have real problems because there is darkness in my book. And I'm happy that I was able to help, but it also moves me you know, in a sad way.
I see, because
people shouldn't need that.
Because you know what they were going through, yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
What you said made me think of the horror genre in particular, where in the horror genre, you know, no matter what, the ending is going to come at too great a cost. Even if it's a happy ending, it makes you feel as though, but at what cost? And those things help us in the real world face that kind of bleak existence with sometimes beyond our control. Same thing with your stories. Even when it's incredibly dark, it helped me process what I was going through and come back to face it in the real world.
And no one ever gives up. No matter how dark it gets, all of my characters keep trying.
That's exactly. And so many of your stories are about people caught in paradigm shifting events.
Well, that's really what I like to write about. So most of my books actually have that.
Yeah.
Usually at the end. I mean, most of my books are about something that shifted the paradigm of the world. And you're actually watching what set it in motion.
Well, yes. And that's actually something I observed across your books, that unless there's some sort of paradigm shifting payoff, it doesn't seem to be big enough to interest you.
That was one of the reasons that I was hesitant to write a sequel to In Conquest Born.
Yeah.
Because that's the ultimate paradigm shift. And I don't really want to come after that and point out what happened, because first of all, it just can't be as powerful. It can't. Yeah. I have just picked like the big event, the end of Coldfire. I'm going to try to do this without spoilers. It is not easy. The end of Coldfire. The entire world changes. There is no way to set a sequel in that's going to equal what those books did. You just can't, because it was on a scale. I used to joke with friends that every sequel of a fantasy movie involved a god, because in the first movie, they destroyed or threatened the biggest thing they could imagine, like the whole world was in danger. You know what I mean? The magic from the end of time was coming, and they had to deal with it. And then they have a sequel and they feel they have to top it, and there is nothing left but dealing with gods. So through the 80s, as you watch fantasy series, you would always see movie number 2 threw a god into the story. It was the only thing that could up the ante. And then by 3, they kind of gave up on trying to up the ante, and they just, okay, let's make more stories.
Right.
But that's one reason I'm not thrilled with sequels, is because I am telling the story of the transformation of a society, or in this case, the transformation of an entire world.
Right.
That I think is diminished if the next thing you write is more adventures of.
Well, right. And I think that we've seen that borne out by so many franchises recently that were not left to die at their peak. If you're not able to enrich what came before, you shouldn't do it.
I kind of feel that way. The pressure to do it is really strong. The pressure, because it sells books, people want it. People, I can't tell you how many people I have begging for more Gerald Tarrant stories, but they want a Gerald Tarrant that doesn't exist anymore. That's the problem. By the end of the book, not only has the world transformed, but he has transformed. And the things they want to see with him aren't going to happen after the end of the book. That's one reason I was really happy with Nightborn. I'll do it primitive style here.
Sure, go for it.
This is my newest novel, Nightborn, and it is a prequel to the Coldfire trilogy. And I'm very happy with how that worked out, because there's 1,200 years of history on Erna. It's hinted at a lot. Part of it is seen in the prologue to When True Night Falls. And there are a lot of stories to tell that are exciting, that feed into the trilogy, because they're giving you all kinds of information that will help enrich the trilogy. But they don't have to come after in the changed world. And there are earlier transformations. The Nightborn takes place when the colonists first arrive. The planet has no idea what humans are. It's trying to connect to them and totally failing. And humans are dying, and they have to adapt to something that they don't even know what it is, and it's not even in their vocabulary to guess what it is. So it's a paradigm shift. Again, it's the changing of the world from one that is hardcore science to one where they now have to view the world through mystical symbolism and such. And I love that. I think I effectively showed how that change happened, because that's a big psychological change. Scientists don't sit around going, we can't control it, why don't we dig up the Testament of Solomon and try some words? You need to see the progression of how did these totally rational scientific people come to the decision that they had to try this, and why did it work, so that 1,200 years later we get something that looks like an epic fantasy.
Right. And I think that's part of the hook for so many people, that it's like, but I could see this happening. I could see us encountering a planet like what they encounter in Coldfire.
I, first of all, from a reader point of view, as much as people begged me for it, I don't think they'd be happy with it, because I mean, I did basically destroy the elements that people liked about the book.
I
You know what I
understand.
mean? And
Yeah.
hopefully the payoff for that was a really satisfying ending. You do see an entire world change, and it's after 1,200 years of people sacrificing their lives and offering up their souls to make that change happen. So it's a really big deal. But after that, it would be a book in a different world. You know, even the Yinzi would now be dealing with people who played by different rules. Now, to some extent, I took the most interesting question: what happens if magic requires self-sacrifice?
We're going, yes.
And that's the Magister theory.
Yes.
That's the Magister series.
Yes.
They're not connected as worlds, but it does answer the question: how does a totally selfish bastard who's determined not to die get around the fact that sorcery now requires that he die? I also don't like to hand endings to people. I leave my books a little open, because I want to stimulate your imagination. I want you to put down the book and go to bed and not be able to sleep. I want you to be bothered all night by thinking about what would happen after the book and what would happen to the characters. Weeks later, while you are trying to concentrate on your work, I want my book disturbing your work schedule. I want it getting in the way of your classes.
For sure.
Just to show up and hand on a platter, hey, here's what happened. That's my vision of what happened. At that point, you have a different vision, and it could be an equally valid vision for those characters.
Yeah.
And you have all the fan discussions of what could happen, what did happen, what might happen. I invalidate 90% of those the minute I give you an easy answer.
Yeah.
So there are some things that I think need to end when they end. Unfortunately, the market doesn't encourage that. The market does encourage writing books. I'm very happy with the current project, and here's what I'm going to tell you later. I'll give you the Coldfire timeline. You can put it up.
Sure.
This is a work in progress. I'm making a timeline for all the past historical events of Coldfire, and the purpose is that I will be able to slot in prequels at the world-changing moments, because the paradigm goes through a number of shifts. You have the Rock, who started out as a native species, wind up almost human. We know there was an attempt to wipe them out. We know the canopy was raised. I mean, that's a genocidal war.
Right.
And it's very important. And again, it ties into the trilogy. Everything that I'll write about, you will understand how it affected the trilogy, and it will enrich your understanding of the trilogy, but it will also all stand alone. So to do that, I needed to know what year every single thing happened.
Yeah.
And we use that in Nightborn because, of course, there's a Gerald Tarrant flashback story at the end. And being able to simply put the year on the top of every story means wherever a reader starts reading, they know where it slots into the basic epic. And I would like to make them all so that a reader can start anywhere. I've committed for the rest of my career, I'm going to write Coldfire material and material in my Outworlds, which is this alien shore.
Right.
And I'm going to focus on those two because that's what my readers love. I promise I will never write anything that I will die before finishing. I'm not going to start a series that I can't finish, because I know how furious the fan world is over that at this point. So, you know, I'm committing to this as the project, and there's no future with dozens and dozens of books, and I have to work more things out. This is the plan for probably as long as I continue to write.
I wonder, sort of to transition out of that, do you have any ideas that feel or sound cool, but just don't fit the kind of stories that you see through to the end?
I would say at this point, if I don't see something through the end, it's a seed. It's not that I don't want to follow it. It's that it hasn't percolated in my brain enough. And that is why I'm a very slow writer, because it takes about a year for all the various elements of a large book to all come together in my head. I'm working right now on the third book in Outworlds, this variant Seed.
Yeah.
And it deals with some really interesting topics, including body dysphoria. So it'll deal with a lot of things I think might have to be handled very carefully, but I think my readers really relate to and find interesting. But I didn't know where that was going. I think I know where I'm going now. I just know there's the seed. Here's what I want to do. Now I have an element and maybe an ending, because I usually have the ending of the book first. And I don't know how to get there. I don't know what my characters are. I don't know what my story is, but that doesn't mean I don't go through with it. It just means it hasn't fermented enough.
Yeah.
You know, I just have to read books and keep pouring things into my head. And in the case of the Outworld, I spend hours, I spend days talking to people who have the neurodiverse conditions that I'm writing about, because I don't. So I don't have personal insight into them. So I spent a lot of time for this Alien Shore talking to people who dealt with autism and dealt with people who had autism.
Right.
And that's inspiring to me. You know, that gives me things to deal with. In that series, I'm trying to write about mental conditions I don't have.
Mm.
And you have to pour in a lot from the outside to be able to get enough information and get it all to gel to be able to say something meaningful that feels real and honest.
Yeah.
I sometimes put things aside for another book.
Mm.
But rarely. I think it may happen more with the Cold Fire Project, that I might go into a prequel and discover there's something that could be developed later. But as you saw from the timeline, that is set up for it, because it's designed for me to write a story in a given place and then jump off and write a different story in another place, because they'll all slot in. I don't have to write, if it was they were all in one epic tale, I would have to connect them and have the transitions and go from one to the other. But now I don't. Now I can just say, okay, let's look at this period and tell a story. Now let's look at this event and tell a story.
Right. It's a wonderful map.
Thank you. It is in progress, and I'm warning you of that because I may move some of the times around later.
Oh, sure.
That's for your watchers who might like grab a copy and go, oh, Cold Fire Trilogy.
Sure.
It is on my webpage, and it will be updated there.
Right, and I'll include a graphic of it, or at least the current iteration of it.
Yep, I'll send it to you.
So I felt struck, and I must say seen, by your comments to Nikki with iWizard about your world building around bio and neurodiversity. How for you, the people marginalized as different. In your stories, just as we so often see in the real world, they're not lesser, but simply different. And those people see themselves as inherently worthy. Their differences are not limitations. Their differences are these unique opportunities. And you said, quote, they are points of pride and constructive creativity rather than resentment. And I just wonder if you could expand on what you'd like to express about your own journey, pushing up against what people told you were limitations, and in what ways have you discovered your differences as worthiness?
I was very fortunate in having parents that basically didn't talk about limitations or acknowledge them. Anything we wanted to do, they supported us. My father taught me that anything you wanted to learn, you never knew when it would be valuable. Go ahead. If you want to take a weird course in something that seems to be unrelated to your life, do it, because you never know. He gave us an example that he had a hobby of photography, and 20 years later, he started writing articles about electronic equipment and had to do his own photography.
Wow.
So they were totally behind this in every form, shape, or manner. Could not ask for better parents for this kind of thing at all. I have a disorder that I'm dealing with for the next Alien Shore book, which I'm not going to mention because I would like it to surprise people. So getting around the spoiler will be hard. But it was a very tough one because I've taught kids who have this. I've dealt with it a lot. And I have never had anyone with it ever say there was any facet of it they were grateful for. I've seen people with autism write that there are facets of autism they're grateful for, and they wouldn't change it if they could.
Sure.
Legitimately. Or some of them say, this is really hard to deal with, but this is the flip side, and they kind of balance out, you know? But this is a condition where I've never heard anyone say that they wouldn't get rid of it in an instant if given the option. And so I just put out a call on some social networks. I said, anybody have this condition that has anything positive to say? And I actually found a couple of people. Wow. And they gave me tremendous insight into how that handicap could be viewed as a gift, which of course is what the whole Garen Society is about. And that was the hardest one I've done because it doesn't lend itself to that. Autism does. Autism has benefits in concentration and other things that are kind of easy to point to. It's like you have to get all the societal expectations out of the way and clear out the crud.
Yes.
But there are things that it gives you in return for all the difficulty. But there are other conditions where it's not as obvious.
Back when you first released this Alien Shore, I read it as representation for dissociative identity disorder.
That was Jamisia. Jamisia had the idea.
Yes. And it felt to me like one of the most powerful representations I had, to this day, I've still seen of it. We still, I mean, because what we instead get are like, not that movies like Identity aren't good, but that's not really a good representation of the disorder. You know?
Well, that was an interesting one to research because, first of all, at the time, we didn't have the internet like this. So researching anything was a lot harder. You couldn't just bop on and find a million people with an opinion. At that point, almost every single book on, I'm going to call it multiple personality disorder because that's like in my brain from back then, said, first of all, we're not totally sure it's real, but it seems to happen. This was the Sybil age. And it happens because of really intense sexual abuse. Usually, always abuse, usually sexual abuse. And that was in the 80s that I was doing the research, which was the big satanic scare, which is when they had stories of satanic cults taking children and sexually abusing children in satanic rituals. And then the kids would develop multiple personalities. And that's what all the material was about. And I knew someone who had it. And it wasn't anything like that. It was much more like what Jamisia had. And they were aware of each other. The alters weren't blocking out the primary personality. You know, there was a relationship. And I couldn't find any material on that. It was like it didn't exist. And I couldn't find any material on how it could be caused without extreme sexual abuse. And every now and then I would get a little hint. Like I would get a book that says, you know, this is almost always extreme sexual abuse, but there are several exceptions where that didn't happen. And I'm like, oh, come on, give me the rest of it. At that point, the whole field was obsessed with the satanic ritual sexual abuse thing. So even what seems more normal now that we've spoken to many more people with DID and we have a lot more information, it was like in the mystery darkness back then. I mean, it wasn't even on the research shelves, and it was so hard to find any information or anyone to talk to. So that was a real challenge. I was writing something that I kind of knew could exist, but I had very few records of when it did exist. There was one book, When Rabbit Howls, but that had a flavor of popular writing to it that I wasn't totally sure about trusting any of it. She had a kind of group consciousness where they all talked to each other, but the book didn't feel like it was necessarily going for the hardcore, precise depiction of exactly what happened. You know what I mean?
Yes.
It was a little romanticized and dressed up. So I wasn't sure how much to trust it.
Well, I think you did a really good job.
Thank you so much.
What I love about it is even the parts that didn't resonate with me didn't feel as though it was in conflict with my experience. And I think
that's the goal.
Sometimes what feels insulting about other representations where I feel as though I need to argue with them, but that's not what I experience. And I feel seen by what I read in your stories, not challenged.
Thank you. Well, I want you to feel like what you experience is part of a spectrum in which I may be exploring a different part of it.
Yeah.
But the fact that I'm exploring it doesn't mean the other parts don't exist.
Right.
And best example I can give you is the word autism never exists in this Alien Shore. I have a character whose personality and mental state are based on, they're modeled on autism, but it's never said that he's autistic. And he doesn't have to be exactly autistic. It could be another condition that has many of the same qualities, but not exactly the same qualities. And that gives me the freedom to not worry about anyone trying to pin me down, because I'm not saying autistic people act like this. I'm saying this character, who is kind of this type, does this. And you can see the connection, but he's not setting an example for anyone.
Yes. Yes. Well, that ties into my next question for you.
There we go.
So my graduate research, actually at University of Georgia.
So sorry. Well, you got to tell me now what your degree is in.
Oh, it's in journalism and mass communication.
Okay. Now you can go back to the details.
because I was going to go into English, but all they wanted to do was sit around and make rhetorical arguments about what they preferred. And if it was persuasive, it was seen as good. And I was like, but I want to come at this with data. I want to be able to show the statistics behind why this story is going to be accessible, engaging, and impactful for my readers. And the journalism department was where I could find the research methods to do so. Well, and so anyway, the point of the question was just that you mentioned to Nikki that one thing your editor, Betsy, recently helped you strengthen was how to bring us into the decisions made in those earliest days on Erna without readers feeling like the characters are making stupid decisions to justify what happens in the story. And
that's my biggest hate.
We call that too stupid to live.
I have such a hate on for any story that uses somebody being stupid to further the plot. At that point, and by stupid, I mean something so patently obvious to the reader that they can't believe the person didn't pick it up. Yep. It's my personal hate. I hope to never do it. I try very hard to never do it. Now there are flip sides to this. One is they have to never do anything stupid. But the other is if they do something stupid, you have to justify it. It doesn't mean they can't do something stupid, but it means you have to be in their head enough that you understand why and you buy it. Yeah. And as I said to Nikki, trying to do this again without spoilers, there are a couple of people who do things in Nightborn that later they wonder if it was the right thing to do. And it's kind of ambiguous whether it was the right thing to do. But what Betsy wanted me to do was make those moments of decision so clear that when they happened, we understood why that was the choice. Yeah. We understood why they weren't having the second thought that said, oh, but this could come from it. We had to see their reasoning and be in their head. I mean, to me, that's the beauty of fiction, is that you get a reader to be able to experience someone else's psyche and to experience their paradigm and to see the world through their eyes. And of course, that's the interesting part about the Outworld series when you're dealing with neurodiversity. If I can put you in the head of someone who has a condition that you don't, you can experience that. And I mean, think of what a human connection that is to grasp it in a way you can't possibly get from a textbook.
Yes. You know? And there's even a communal consciousness kind of effect when someone who feels represented by something in your book, when they see that book doing well, it has a communal perception. I feel seen, and I know how many other people are being seen because of how popular the book is.
Well, that's good. As I said, and I hesitate to give out details of anything because it takes me so long to write. I am going to be dealing with body dysphoria in the next book, not particularly gender. I'm avoiding that, and that's not what it's about. But the concept that one's body is not correct and is not right and cannot be accepted.
Yes.
And I'm going to deal with that. And I hope it'll be interesting and kind of dark because, I'm a dark writer. So the dark side of everything is what I'm looking at. But I do want to explore that very much. And I have a number of trans friends who I'm talking to a lot. I mean, it's a different experience because the gender thing is a little different than what I'm doing in the book. But it's that same sense that you're trapped in a body that isn't right. It isn't correct. And you're not going to be able to come to terms with it the way it is. Mm-hmm. So trappedness, I think, is what I get from them,
Yes.
And so that will be one of the themes of the next book. Wow. And hopefully that will resonate with a lot of people.
I think so, and I think it will be timely.
Very, very timely. My hope is that's a very thin line to walk because it's so, it's so fraught with emotion. Yeah. And again, I don't want to be seen as making a statement about anything going on now or a statement about transgenderism, which kind of vaguely is connected to what I'm talking about, but it's not going to be in the book, partly for that reason. I don't want to go there and say, okay, you have to think of it this way because this is how the plot goes. Let me just deal with the mental condition of the mismatch between brain and body, just in its pure state.
And in a way that will help a larger audience connect with what you're saying.
I hope so. I really hope so. So the question in the next book is going to be, if you could actually make the change you wanted, would that satisfy? Or is
Yes.
there something in you that's not going to be satisfied and it's just going to find a new channel? So that's a very deep and disturbing question. And that's what science fiction allows us to explore. Because in this world, there are changes you can't make, but in my world, I can create whatever situation I need.
Yeah. Quite a challenge for yourself, but honestly, it feels like you're not interested unless it's quite that challenging. You need to be able to reach for something so powerful and profound. If it's not going to have a paradigm shifting effect on your readers, why?
And especially for this series, because the second book I really enjoyed. I love the characters. It's the same diverse world, but some of my readers were disappointed that it wasn't so focused on somebody's cognitive state.
You
know what I mean? The story wasn't as dependent upon that element. So we're going to go back to that. But this is the first one where I had a discussion with my editor, and I said, this is what I'm thinking of. I said, this is probably be the hardest thing I've ever written. Wow. And I'm not sure I can do it because there is a level, but it's not mostly this. It's mostly because I'm dealing with the diversity element that I told you before, where people don't see good things in it. And I said, how do I put my reader into a mindset that can focus on the plot properly? You know what I mean? How do I make that work, that I'm telling the story, but it may not be something where my character is connecting to every part of the story? And she said she felt I could do it. She said, you did the multiple personality thing. After that, I think you can do anything.
Right.
But this one is going to have some serious challenges for me as a writer. And I did put off the multiple personality for many years. I knew that I wanted to do a multiple personality character. And I knew when I was a young writer, I wasn't ready for it. Yeah. And I needed my writing skill to get to a certain point before I was going to tackle something like that.
Well, I think at this point, you've earned our trust.
Thank you. That means a lot.
I did want to ask you more directly about Betsy.
Ask whatever you want. You can always clip out anything that's
from an editing author perspective. What is it she brings to that collaboration that empowers your storytelling in a way you couldn't do without her? Do you have any examples?
Well, first of all, she has always believed in me, heart and soul. She has believed in me. She has believed in my writing. She has let me write what I wanted to write. We might have a discussion about how a sequel would probably sell if I'd be willing to write one. And I know she wants, it's hair. And I know she wants them, but she never pushed me. Yeah. She worked with me in whatever I wanted to write. In my early career, there was a lot of experimentation. Some things worked better than other things. I wanted to see how many different styles I could write, because my books are all different styles. They're not just subjects. Right. But the epic fantasy is a different style than the modern science fiction. I wanted to spread my wings. I wanted to exercise my writing ability. I wanted to find readers who would like me experimenting with different things. And she's always supported me and guided me, and she has tremendous insight into my work. I have talked to some other, she's the only editor I've had, but I've talked to some others in the process of getting to her being my editor who just didn't get it. And yeah. I sat there going, well, one suggested a happy ending for In Conquest Born where they got together. My two characters got together. And I just sat there and yeah. She read the book. She loved the book. She just thought that the characters needed to be the climax of the book, that they get together. And I'm a new author and I didn't want to blow my chances. So I'm sitting there with the same friendly smile on my face thinking, oh my God, talk about missing the point. And later when I talked to Betsy, Betsy's like, no, she did not get it. So I know from other editors that they may not have. She has a tremendous gift of seeing what I'm trying to do, even if I haven't succeeded in doing it. And that's what she did with Nightborn. She looked at the scene. She says, I know what you're trying to get out of this, but you didn't get it on the paper.
Yes.
So she is a vital part of my creative process. And I can't even imagine my writing career without her. I can't imagine my career without her. And I can't imagine writing the books with what's in them without her input.
I'm glad you found her, because I know what that's like when you find the person that just helps you have the conversation you need to have to finish the book.
Yeah.
um,
And this is going to be a tough one because, like I said, I'm handling some stuff that is going to be very, very, very hard to write. I'll have point of view characters who are not inherently narrators. So that's going to be a challenge.
could I ask you a question deep into your career back when you were first writing in Conquest Born? You have hinted
Like when I was 12?
Well, you've hinted at a cold winter night when you began drafting the pages that were ultimately, and I just wondered if you could expand on where you were at. What would it be like
Sure.
being in your shoes in that moment?
I had my first job up in Geneseo, which was by Rochester. It's in the snow belt. It's very cold and it's in the snow belt. And if you've ever been in the snow belt, basically all the moisture comes off the Great Lakes and then gets dumped on the snow belt. So it is an amount of snow totally out of proportion to anything north or south. It's just this part of the country that gets dumped on, and it was in there. So sometimes you would completely get locked in. I mean, they'd managed to dig out the town, but you weren't going anywhere else for a while. And at that point, I was writing for my own pleasure. I really never thought of or even desired to get published. I just wrote for fun. And I wrote to let off steam. And if I was really tense and worked up emotionally, I would let it pour out into my work. And my depression poured into my work a lot too. That darkness is there because it was in me and I needed to give it a voice. And so I really do not remember what my students did to piss me off, but it was one of those days when it was just frustration after frustration. Everything I was trying to do, I felt like I was fighting uphill, and I was fighting uphill with the faculty on something, on a show. And I came home so wound up, and I was like, came home, my days went to very late at night. I was working like 12 to 14-hour days in the shop after teaching. And I came home and I'm like, I can't sleep. There's no possible way I can sleep. I'm just so wound up, it can't happen. So I thought, okay, I'll just write until I get tired. And that's chapter 11 of In Conquest Born, when she traverses the ice planet.
Yeah.
And it is not just cold, but it's bleak and alone. And again, it's about that quality we've talked about, which runs through all my work, of determination, that no matter how bad things are, no matter how daunting challenges are, my characters are determined and will push through. And that's the character trait that drives them. And especially for that character, that's her absolute character trait. No matter what they put in her past, she's just going to keep fighting. And all the emotional elements of being alone and being isolated and needing to connect and being in a world out of one's control and stuck in it for a period of time, because of course, while you're on your teaching contract, you have to, you can't go, gee, I really hate the weather, I think I'll leave. It just kind of all poured out. And it was one of those moments when you get so wrapped up in what you're doing, you don't feel time anymore. You're not aware of anything. You just keep writing. I did 30 pages. Now that's double spaced on a regular typewriter. And it just flew. It just wrote itself. And at the end, I looked up and the sun was coming up.
Wow.
And I realized I'd been up all night just typing from one end of the night to the other, channeling this incredible surge of energy. It's still one of my very favorite things that I've ever written. I think I included that chapter in my book of short stories, The Dreaming Kind, which is on Amazon.com. And Daw does not publish short stories, so I did that myself. So everybody should go to Amazon.com and support my effort. And the short stories have lots of different styles and ideas, and they're funny and they're dark humor, and some are just dark, but it's my stuff. But it was fun. I like doing short fiction, and it's a little different than my long fiction. Anyway, I think I included in that book that chapter.
Yes.
So in addition to the new stuff, I put in a couple of old things for people who hadn't seen it. And I still read it, and I can still feel all that emotion.
Well, that was going to be my next question, if you ever revisit it and still get that feeling, but yeah, of course.
The stuff I've written that was brilliant, I read it and I can't believe I wrote it. I mean, there was some stuff I read where I really achieved that pinnacle of writing. a creativity.
Uh,
And I go back and I look at it and I can see it. And I almost can't believe it was me. I'm like, how did I do this? You know?
yeah, a real sense of
Um,
gratitude that it happened.
yeah.
Yeah.
When
Uh,
those days happen and you are possessed by the muse and the world disappears and it is just you focusing pure creativity into a project, those happen when they happen. You can't make them happen.
yeah.
And you just gotta put aside everything else and go with the flow and ride the white water to
Right.
wherever it leads you,
Right.
because those chances don't happen every day.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I also had a question about another one of your short stories, as well as the Wilding. The Wilding, I'll ask first. You mentioned, I think I remember this right, that it's dedicated to your creative writing students at the time.
Yes, I'm trying to remember now, this was a long time ago. I had a creative writing class and I gave them some science fiction prompts and other things to do. And they came up with some interesting ideas. And I said, could I use them? And they said, sure. And they were not plot centric ideas. There was just one about a planet they visit where the background of the planet. Now, the original concept, which was of an alien species that did not have a sex until a certain age. So in their childhood, they did not know what sex they were going to be. And it would be a physical change, but it wasn't necessarily something they could control. So they go through their young lives knowing that. I created that. My students didn't create it, but I created it because of them. I made up ideas because of them that I then used.
That's so cool.
So it wasn't like I was using things they gave me,
I
but it
understand.
was like they inspired me to create things that later I put to use.
Wow, neat.
Yeah, it was.
I also wanted to ask about, if I remember correctly from your interview with Nikki, you mentioned that you have I think it's just an unpublished short story that was inspired by some of the lessons on life and death you remember your mom sharing with you.
Oh, no, yeah, well, no, it wasn't not published. It was in a DAW anthology. It didn't quite get the exposure I would have liked it to have gotten.
I see. So
Um,
I see.
so it's in that book and it's in Dreaming Kind and it's called Downtime. And I think it is probably the single best thing I've ever written. And it probably would have been up for awards if it had gotten more exposure that year.
Really?
But
Wow.
it was an anthology that I think didn't get out there enough. I had to put it away because my mom died. It is about a woman who is visiting her mom, and they have a technology which will allow the illusion of one person being able to use the body of another. Now, it is an illusion. They're sending mental signals back and forth. So they get control of the body remotely. They get feedback from the body, but they're not actually like in it, so it's more reasonable science. But they do have the ability to let someone see the world through their physical body for a while. And in that world, there is a filial obligation that it is expected that when your parents become old and infirm, the younger generations that they gave birth to and nurtured will give them some time in their bodies in relationship to how much they owe their parents. And the main character is a woman who, for reasons of her sister's death, this responsibility is just falling on her for the first time. And she's having to deal with the fact that she's going to have to let her mother basically take over her body and use it for a short period of time. And at about that point, when I was playing with that idea, my mother died, and she died not a good death. She died from heart failure, and it was slow, and I was living with her the last year. And I couldn't handle it. I couldn't handle all the questions that it brought up and the feelings. And my feeling of, if that happened, if you could do that, if a parent that you loved was dying and you could let them use your body for a day and just take it over, would you? And that's what Betsy said when she read it. That was her first thought. She sits there going, would I have done this with my mother?
Yes.
And I knew it was that powerful, and I just couldn't handle it then. So I put it away, and I picked it up much later. And it's a perfect science fiction story from my point of view. It's concept and character and emotion in just the right balance. and it raises a profound issue in the way that science fiction can through a narrative. But the sense of what the mother wanted, so she is almost completely disabled at this point. The mother's dying and disabled and in a home, the joy of life is gone. She has no connection to life anymore, and her daughter's going to give her a day to be in a young body again and do whatever she wants. And the concept of what she wants, I got from my mother.
Wow.
And I remember her talking to me as she was dying of things that seemed like silly little things, but they meant so much to her because she'd lost them.
Yeah.
My mother was upset that she couldn't take a shower on her own anymore. And it was a really, really big deal to her that she couldn't even stand in a shower without help. And that's the kind of thing a young person would never think of. But all the things this woman wanted most out of life that she used that day to get were simple little things that you look at them and suddenly you realize how much they mean when you don't have them. So it's a very moving story. It's very, very powerful. And my mom's experience is in there, very much so.
Wow, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, I'm happy to share that part with everybody. I do think stylistically, writing abilities, story being put together wise, message, I do think it's the most powerful thing I've ever written.
Wow.
It's the thing I'm proudest of. So.
Wow. Yes, I think you're right.
It's in the short story book. It's in the short story.
It does what the best sci-fi does, allows you to speak to something. Well,
it allows you to make profound statements while focusing on a narrative rather than looking like you're making profound statements. I can make my readers think about something without having to give them a lecture about the something.
Yes.
I can spur their brains to think about a certain subject. And that's the beauty of it when it's done really, really well. And that's the beauty of the Outworld series. I mean, which is so just chock full of thoughts about the whole neurodiversity thing and belonging and acceptance and what we could be if everything was acceptable and a society adapted to that. The society has to adapt. You can't just accept people who are all on a different wavelength. You have to have some kind of societal structure that enables them to work together. So they're not like dogs and cats wagging their tails at different speeds. You know what I'm talking about? When dogs and cats meet and a dog wags its tail, it's being really friendly. And if a cat whips its tail back and forth, it is really pissed and it is about to attack you. And the problem when you introduce them together, if you don't introduce them right, is they're just speaking different languages and they cross purposes and fight. But when they grow up together and they know that that's what it means, dogs and cats can be friends and they're not having any problem. And I think the neurodiversity element is somewhat the same. It's easier for me to deal with someone who is neurodivergent if I know what to expect out of them and I know where to make allowances. If I talk to somebody who doesn't make eye contact with me in a certain way, I might find it creepy. But if I know I'm dealing with Asperger's, where one of the symptoms is that they don't make eye contact in the right way, then I'm just going to know it's the Asperger's and I don't care. It doesn't have a meaning anymore. There's not a creepiness. Yeah. So the whole premise behind Garen Society is that if everybody knows what everybody else is going through, they can make the necessary mental adjustments.
Yeah, and I think it's that kind of dialogue that makes your stuff so impactful and accessible because, as you've pointed out several times, you're not actually making a point. You're having a conversation. You're helping people talk about these things and think about these things and maybe experience something that is not a copy of their own personal experience. So I think that openness is a part of why your works are so well received, why they impact people the way they do.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much. Certainly why the neurodiverse community seems to have embraced them a lot.
Yes. Yes. What advice would you give to yourself at the beginning of your career versus where you are now?
I'm pretty happy with my career. I think I would have gone back to focus on the works I'm focusing on now earlier. I think when I finished with the Magister, I wanted to try something very different. I tried a young adult series, moderately successful. I mean, the ratings are kind of good, but it wasn't the direction I needed to go in. I needed at that point, I'd gotten all my experimentation out of my system. And I needed to go back to the core books that my readers really, really loved and focus on them more. So I would have done that earlier if I could have talked to myself. For the rest of it, I would have just yelled at myself to write faster, but that never worked. So
Right. I mean, sometimes it makes you write slower because you're like, wow, I really beat up on myself today.
but I had a good editor who let me write what I wanted. My career did well. The book sold well. I was able to write full time, which very, very few writers can do.
Yeah.
I think SIFWA came up with statistics. I think it was like only 10% of professional writers actually made their whole living writing, which I don't do anymore, but for a while I was.
Right.
So I had the luck and I had the right people and I had the talent and I got to do something I really, really loved. And there's not much that I would fix.
Yeah.
But 20 years later, I'm a much better writer. I did get to go back in the Coldfire trilogy and I did get to go back in Black Sun Rising and make some very small changes, but I think they were important changes. And some of it was just stylistic, but just little things that needed tweaking of the stuff we've talked about, where I had something happening and I just hadn't made it clear enough to the reader.
I see.
So I just was able to go back now and tweak a couple of sentences and just make absolutely sure the point got across. And this is partly because, that trilogy is still selling a lot, but also because I was writing Nightborn, so the interest in the trilogy might be sparked up again. And so I asked my editor, I said, can we make the investment and get this right? But there are very few books that I couldn't look back on and there wasn't a scene I'd like to change. One of them is that I really hate to read battle scenes, so I really hate to write them. And in a couple of books, this should have been a battle scene. And I found a way out of it. And I was very proud of myself for finding a plot way to not need one, but I shouldn't have gone that way. I managed to get out of writing a battle scene, but the book needed one and I should have done it. So that's my major regret in a couple of them.
I see what you mean. Yeah, if only I could have done that. But you're right. Sometimes it's like, well, I maybe if I had another 10 years to get ready for this, but I'd like to publish the book.
That's pretty much it. New writers often ask, how do you know when you're done? And basically, you know when you're done when you're so sick of it, you don't want to look at it anymore, or you need the check for turning it in.
Right.
You can't be a professional writer if you don't at some point turn in the book, and there will never come a point at which is perfect. Never, never, ever.
Right.
There will never come a point at which you read something you write and don't want to change something.
Yeah, and also just to accept this is the best you are capable of doing this right now. Anything else will change the experience, but it will merely be different. It won't be the difference in it being a better book.
Well, as I put it, when you go through a story and you rewrite it, get some sleep, look at it the next day, and then ask yourself, did I make it better or did I just make it different?
Yes.
And if the answer is different, the work is done.
Yes.
That's it. You're finished. Because you may have a certain sentence structure on Monday that really appeals to you, and on Tuesday it seems very choppy and odd and you change it. But by Wednesday, you realize that isn't a better choice. It was just a different choice. You were in a slightly different mood.
Yeah.
When you're not actually improving the work anymore, that's when you have to put a period on it.
Well, okay. So this is not really some comments before a question, so I can entertain you for a second. My favorite parts of your my favorite parts of your books are actually
Feed my ego.
So my favorite parts of your books are actually the openings to When True Night Falls and Crown of Shadows, where you do the same kind of argument that Stephen King does in his Dark Tower books. Each new one, he'll recap what's happened up to that point. Well, it's just the way you told those two recaps. One of my favorite genres is mystery thriller, where there's unreliable narrators. And it was the unreliable narrator experience that thrilled me so much, because every time Damien would say, oh shit, can't say that, and then you'd have to retell the story he just told for the patriarch or something. To me, those kinds of subversive experiences are what stand out for me about your storytelling style. I never know quite what I'm going to get, but it's going to feel surprising yet inevitable.
I think some of that comes from my being Jewish, and I hope I don't offend any Christians who are listening to this, but
Sure,
for me as a Jew, this guy lived 2,000 years ago, did some teachings, made a big splash, died. And 2,000 years later, we have Christianity, totally convinced that he's a god, since to a Jew, it's obvious he's not one. I'm looking at what happened in that man's life that led to this, you know? And that awakened me not only to a concept, but to a timetable, how legends can be made out of things that weren't legendary to start with. And you had me playing with this for the first time in Conquest Born, with the legend of Hasha, where you discover it's not something supernatural and spiritual at all. It's an event that happened, and after being embroidered upon for 10,000 years, this is what it became. When we look back on history, we don't necessarily know what happened anymore, even if we think we do.
Right.
And the whole birth of Christianity, which was kind of like really in full swing by the Middle Ages. So I gave myself, I figure about 1,000 years appears to be a good slot of time for something happened with people, and it has now been woven into a completely different story that people believe actually happened. So what the cold fire people talk about having happened in the beginning is not necessarily what happened in the beginning. And that is a running theme in my work, that people don't necessarily know their own history.
Yeah, well, I feel like the twists in your stories, they're not really twists. You know, they're the best kind of twist where once it's revealed, you feel as though, if only I had understood, I would have seen that from the beginning. I just took the entire book to understand everything that's involved in this.
That's my goal. I want everything to fit together so logically that you go, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I totally get this now. Now I understand why the 3 or 4 things that I didn't know why they happened. And there's a lot of that in Nightborn because they're dealing with the Fae for the first time. So there's one spoiler I will give away, that something, because it's just a little Easter egg for my Coldfire fans. There's one horrific thing that happens caused by the Fae, and it's bigger and nastier than what has happened before. And they don't really address that it was worse, but it is a little different. And Coldfire fans will recognize that there was a small earthquake right before that. So the fans of the trilogy understand the earthquakes release the Fae, so it's in greater quantity.
I see.
And that's what allowed this event to happen, that there was just more power pouring into whatever was happening. So I didn't bother to explain that because they don't know, so there is no way to explain it, but fans of the trilogy will recognize that's what's happening.
An audience superior knowledge moment. That's
yes.
Really cool. Well, I also like that about your other works, where once you finish them, I believe it's one reason they continue to sell so well is because they reward repeat readings.
Yeah.
Once you understand what's really happening, you want to read it again and have a much richer connection and understanding of what really happened from page 1.
Like when you watch The Sixth Sense for the second time.
It makes a difference. It's like nothing's different, but everything's changed.
And you realize that things that you saw or things that you read had meaning and had things going on that you weren't aware of at all.
Yes.
And the second time around, you see them and you see the craftsmanship. That's what I feel when I watch The Sixth Sense, is the sheer craftsmanship of that film.
Yes.
And how they pulled it off. You also have to, I think, never have a story depend on surprising the reader, because especially in the world of science fiction and fantasy, they're going to be trying to second guess you, and some of them will. So you can have an important surprise that adds to the climax of the book, but you can never have the payoff of the story completely dependent on the reader being surprised.
Right.
You just lose it. And even in Nightborn, where something at the end I would hope is surprising enough that you go, oh my God. I have to recognize that for some readers, it won't be. And the story still has to hold together, even for them. Even if they guess that this was coming, my story still has to work.
I have some questions that are sort of taken from the end of Inside the Actor Studio. There'll be really fun questions for you.
Okay.
Okay, so and
Yeah, you got the heavy ones, so I'm due for the fun ones.
well, Celia, what is your favorite word?
What is my favorite word? Okay, you gotta give me a minute for this. You can feel free to edit the minute out, but I want to think of an interesting answer. What is my? I actually do have a favorite word, but for some reason I'm like train off the track on it. Let that sit in the back of my head while you ask me other things, because
What is your least favorite word?
epitome, no question.
Really?
Yeah, because it's spelled epitome, and I actually did not know, because I'm a reader and I don't hear things when I read. I actually did not know that it was not epitome until I was about 50, literally. I went through my entire life. Every time I saw it, I pronounced it epitome in my brain, and I knew what epitome meant in context, you know? And then one day somebody said it and I saw it written. I'm like, holy shit. So yeah, it breaks every rule.
That's wonderful.
It betrayed me. It has betrayed me.
I understand. It's especially when you're a heavy reader, you encounter a lot of words that you just never hear said out loud.
I like, I think it's Schadenfreude, the German word. Do you know
Yeah,
the one I'm talking
yeah,
about?
yeah.
Because of what it expresses. I mean, I don't like the concept, but that is the pleasure someone takes in the misfortune of someone else.
Well, you can. I mean,
Really powerful thing to have a word for, isn't it?
especially as a writer, you're allowed to be in love with words and what they mean and what they evoke.
Zeitgeist is a winner too. I love the concept of zeitgeist.
I love
The
science.
the essence of a time period. I mean, it's like paradigm, but more than paradigm. You know, I love that one too. Most of the English words I really love are from other languages, and of course, Yiddish. Can't beat Yiddish for fun words.
I see.
I mean,
Any favorites you want to share?
well, chutzpah. Um, what was I just? Now again, I'm trying to remember, because I just listed that. I just wrote something on Quora about my favorite Yiddish words. And they're not coming, but it'll come back to me. But Yiddish has so many words for personality types. Kvel. Kvel's my favorite word. I would put that the number one. To kvel in Yiddish and in English, if you adopt it, is to go on and on about how great something is. And to gush. And it has a value in of itself. And so if a kid does something well, her parents are going to be kvelling about him. You know, they'll be saying to all their friends, this is my son. He wrote this story. This is so cool. They want it for the paper. Do you know what his teacher said? And he got an A. It was the highest grade in the class. Kvelling is where you just gush about something good that somebody did, or that you did. It's when you have to go to somebody and you feel the need to just brag and say, look what I did. Look at this gorgeous thing I did. Have you seen how gorgeous this is? Look at page 3. Can you believe this? You know, and it's fun because when you have the word, it's it's a tool. And I've been in situations where like my brother would tell me something that was really good, and we'd talk about it, we move on to something else, and he'd like, no, I need more felling on that. So, you know, I would praise him more, and then we'd move on to the next thing. So it's a really powerful word, and it's lacking in some cultures. I know I've had some Asian students, especially Korean students, in my creative writing class, where no matter what they did and no matter how well they scored, that was the one thing they would not get at home. Their parents expected A's, so if they got A's, it satisfied them. But there was never this gushing of, oh, how wonderful this A is. So they're like total polar opposites, culturally speaking.
Wow. Well, that was definitely worth the wait for you to search for your favorite word.
Yeah, it's a good word.
What engages you?
I enjoy the creative process. And when you create something that is awesome and you look at it and you get to quell about it.
Yeah.
My dad was a technical writer, and he would at night we'd have dinner, and then he'd go in his office and he'd do his writing, magazine articles, and while we watched TV or something. And I remember he would come out sometime once, and he would read a sentence to us. It was a sentence about some electronic equipment or something. And he would tell about how is this not an awesome sentence? Is this not one of the great uses of the colon that you have ever seen in your life? And specifically, I remember the colon concept where he said people do not use colons, properly and creatively, and they avoid using colons. This is an awesome sentence with a colon in it. The beauty of a single sentence was something he wanted to share with me.
Yeah.
And when I write well, when I have those moments when it's really flowing, and I look at those sentences, those are the moments. I know that's in me. I don't have the ability to tap it every single time I want. So when it flows out, it's like magic.
That makes sense. And I love that story about your dad, because that makes sense even as a technical writer. If you're in love with the beauty of language and a perfectly phrased sentence.
Right. And he raised me to understand that. He said, it doesn't matter what you're writing, all writing's the same. He said there may be different rules about structure or something. He says, you're writing fiction, my writing technical articles. There is no form of writing. If you can do one, you can do them all. The skills are the same. The skill set's the same. The goal's the same, communication,
Right. Well, to
so,
go in the direction, what disengages you?
What disengages me? I'm going to say casual bigotry, not people who are really overtly intolerant, but people who just have assumptions about the world that are based on generalizations that are kind of small-minded.
Well, I'm going to ask you about something a little. Oh, I don't know what you'll say to this, actually, Celia. What sound or noise do you love?
Music. I mean,
Okay, yeah.
classical music in particular. I write to music. I have it on all the time.
What do you listen to when you're writing? What really charges your creativity?
Depends. I wrote in Conquest Born to, I was into Russian basses then. I was listening to some Mussorgsky's Boris Godunov. I played repeatedly on the original Mussorgsky orchestration, which is kind of harsh and jarring compared to the later Rimsky-Korsakov orchestration, but I'm really into violin concertos, especially from the classical and romantic periods.
Yes.
They're beautiful. They're almost painful in how beautiful they are.
Yes.
And I'll pay them in the background while I work, but if I'm going to close my eyes and listen to anything, just queuing up half a dozen of those will do it. There are other things I like to listen to, but Brooks Violin Concerto, I think it's A minor, just magnificent. I mean, it just makes you want to cry. It hits nerves inside that are so powerful.
I think you had a theater background, but not this relationship with music.
I did want to design Boris Godunov really, 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 really badly. I mean, it's a magnificent visual opera. I enjoyed my costume design years.
Yes.
I'm sorry that they didn't involve ever having the kind of scope of creativity I would have liked. I was always in a situation at universities where the budget was low, there was no staff. I was using student labor, which might or might not show up. And I really burned out because every single choice I made had to be a question of what can I physically get on stage without having a nervous breakdown from exhaustion, and I enjoyed it. It was a good career. It carried me through about 15 years, but I'm very burned out. It was really bad burnout.
Yeah.
So time to switch. I don't know if I would have been ready for the writing career at that point, and I don't know that a writing degree helps you much. There are only a few things it helps with, one of which is teaching.
Right.
Otherwise, you can be a creative writer without one. So in terms of my getting my degrees, the theater was a better idea. And I was a painter. I was a costumer. I mean, I was creating things with my hands,
Yeah. All part of telling a story.
Pretty much. And in that case, it's a collaborative story where you're working with other people for a joint vision.
Yeah, well, and maybe taught you to have such a great appreciation for Betsy and what a team can build that you may not be able to do on your own.
I have had a lot of experiences in life that I have been allowed to have because my theater background gave me a sense of collaboration that most writers don't have. Writers tend to be extremely egotistical. They're very problematic. They don't necessarily take criticism very well. They love their stuff. They don't want to be told it's not working. I came from theater where you put together some designs, you went to the meeting, the director said, that's not what I'm going for. And you might go home and curse him and have a little voodoo doll with pins in it. But you know that ultimately the goal is that we have to all be on the same page.
Yes.
And that means I might have a perfectly valid creative idea that just doesn't fit this project. So I'm used to that. And I'm used to working with a team of people and that their input matters to what I'm doing. And I've taken that into the writing. So I've been able to have good relationships with my cover artists where normally my editor wouldn't let an author near a cover artist for fear they defend them or be pushy or something.
Yeah.
But they know that I understand and respect their process and that anything I suggest I'm going to do in a way that is part of that process, not is you did a shitty job, change it to this, I can approach collaboration without ego getting in the way. And it's probably one of my most powerful skills. And that came from the theater years. So,
is there anything that you would have done as a profession that's kind of out there from anything that you've already done? It's like something more mundane, like plumbing or something. And I don't mean exactly plumbing, but a different profession that no one would have expected that you might have been interested in if you had gone a different direction.
No, not at all.
Gotcha.
Partly because my parents encouraged everything. I have done everything I wanted.
Wow.
And it was partly because I had their support to do everything I wanted. I got to tell you the end of my going way back to the beginning when I said that my dad said I should learn anything. He said, anything that interests me, just the fact that it interests you means it's worth learning. Go learn it. Don't worry about when you'll use it. Don't worry about what you'll do.
Yeah.
So, in my very expensive elite school in college, I took a class in basket weaving. And it wasn't a big college class for credit, but I wanted to be able to go home and test him and say, yeah, Dad, I'm off at college and I took a class in finger weaving.
I did it.
It was worth it just for the joke,
Let me go the other side of that question. What sound or noise do you hate?
I hate my fire alarm and my smoke alarm.
Oh my God.
Everybody hates the noise.
You don't need
but
to
mine are on a 12-foot ceiling. It literally, when that thing starts going off because the battery is low, it is a shrieking, piercing thing through the whole house for 3 or 4 days until I can get somebody that I have to hire to go up a ladder. So right now, that's on my hate list.
Belongs there. That's right.
What a weird question, though. I never thought of that. I probably have a better answer somewhere in my brain,
Well, let me know later if something better. You're like, oh, I just thought of the one I really hate. Mine, I have a love-hate relationship with my hated sound. It's my cat. I have 2 cats, and one of them gets in the bathtub at 3 a.m. and starts singing. The acoustics are amazing, but I'm trying to sleep.
That's very funny. Oh, I also have to say, I heard a great suggestion for an alarm cat for cat owners.
Oh.
It was the sound of a cat vomiting.
No!
You'd be up in a second in that little pre-vomit moment when you want to get him off the bed. You'd be up and awake in a second.
What is your favorite curse word?
Well, schmuck's a big winner.
Yeah, I know that one.
Which isn't really totally a curse word unless you know what it actually means.
Oh.
Well, it means penis. And so does putz, which is a little nastier, but it also means dick. So
right. I see. Okay. And I just have one last question for you, and then we can say our goodbyes. If heaven exists, what do you want to hear when you arrive?
Well, you're not going to like the answer. It's not happy. I'm Jewish, and I'm an atheist.
I'm an atheist too, so don't worry.
And I'm gonna change that a little bit to sort of what happens if you die and there is a heaven and there is God.
Yes.
And the answer is look him in the face and say, where the fuck were you in 1945? I cannot accept any afterlife with a God in it without an explanation of why that was allowed to happen.
Wow. Yep. I'm with you.
And I think a lot of Jews are with me. There are a lot of Jewish atheists from the generation after World War II because we have a hard time reconciling a belief in God with what happened. And it comes up in conversations with Christians where they'll go, well, what happens if you get to the afterlife and you discover, Christ really was God and God's there? You're standing in front of the throne of God. I'm like, where the fuck were you in 45? And they're
Absolutely. There are some
like,
questions.
oh, now what I expected. And then if it's heaven, I'd ask where the Reuben is, where I can get a Reuben.
A Reuben? Oh, a
Reuben.
sandwich.
Yeah, a Reuben. Hot corned beef and sauerkraut.
Yeah.
Because I assume if it's heaven, they've got like a deli buffet or something.
Man, this is some real light conversation, and then a real heavy question. So, what, Celia? What do you hope you're remembered for?
I hope people are still reading my books forever. I hope. I think my claim to fame is going to be the Cold Fire trilogy.
Yeah.
It was started 30 years ago, long time, and it's still showing up on lists of best fantasies ever. I want to be on those lists. I want 50 years from now, when people talk about the best fantasies ever written, I want to make those lists. Might not make the top 10, but I'd like to get in like the top 50 or so. And, that's immortality. And it's so much my voice and my issues and the things that matter to me go into those books. And with the Outworld series, I'd like to bring something positive into the world for people who deal with neurodiverse conditions, because this is a very powerful way to do it. And I know how many people I've gotten feedback from that just reading about a world where the conditions are accepted and celebrated rather than treated like something is wrong meant so much to people who are struggling to come to terms with their own issues.
Yeah.
Just even to have the fantasy that this would be possible and to be shown how it could work means a lot to people who are really trying to sort out their own identities. I didn't mention it before. Many, many, many years ago, I was invited to do guest of honor for Galacticon. And I said, that's really interesting because I'm like not only not gay, but I have never in my life written a single gay thing. I think I went back and in Conquest Born, there's one passing mention that sometimes men have sex with men because I just couldn't ignore it. I mean, it had to at least be, mentioned in there. But I mean, I've never dealt with this subject. Why are you asking me? And he said, they love your work. They just love your work. They want you. And I had one of the most fascinating weekends of my life. And I had lunch with a lot of trans people, talking to them about issues of identity, because at that point I was working on, I think I was working on This Alien Shore, I'm not sure, but I was working on something where, I was working on Magister trilogy, where Kamala is confronting the knowledge, okay, little spoiler here, but the discovery that they're not actually all male. And that raises the question. You have the contrast of a woman who has entered a male world and absolutely not been willing to compromise her female identity, contrasted with the one who was.
Yes.
One who made that sacrifice.
Yes.
And that's not a lengthy, in-depth thing, but it really has to ring true, because that's the moment when the reader hopefully goes, holy shit, I didn't even think about that, but why am I assuming these are all really men?
Yes.
Exactly. And it helped me so much to have that weekend, because even though I've never experienced the gay side of things and all the issues that come with that while you're growing up, the core question of human identity, I think the foundation that's in us of how we deal with figuring out who we are and coming to terms with the parts of ourselves that we question or that other people question, those stories are really valuable to me, and those talks that weekend had a lot of input into the book after that. And I think for this one will as well. You know,
Wow.
there are a lot of issues, and it was an interesting weekend, and I really enjoyed it. Not anything I ever would have envisioned myself doing. And then when you invited me to do this, and I looked it up, and I realized you were like an activist in that area, I'm like, whoa, deja vu.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I think the fact that I haven't written gay characters,
Yeah.
I think I'll be throwing one into the next book. But as a general focus, I personally am a very heterosexual person. I personally don't really grasp the non-heterosexual thing. So I'm just not going to go there, you know, for a point of view character. I don't think I could do it well. But the fact that I can say things that matter and relate to human striving and human suffering and human secrecy and the desire we all have for acceptance, those aren't specifically belonging to any one community. Those are human, you know, and I want to touch those human nerves. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be able to speak to people who might relate to my work, you know.
Is there anything else you'd like to add in? Anything you want the viewers to know? Like how should they reach out to you? How should they keep up with your updates? What is the best way to stay in?
I'm on Facebook under c.s.friedman, and everybody should come to Facebook. And I'm not that active on it, but they'll get all the updates. And we've done some polls and things. And actually, the title for Nightborn was actually suggested by one of the people on Facebook. And I'd asked them, I said, give me a title, let's go. And there were all sorts of wonderful suggestions, and people said which one they liked most, and it grew out of there. I have a Patreon page, which obviously anyone's support is greatly appreciated because writing does not pay all that well, and it's really being helpful. But we're also building a very nice community there. I'm currently running a contest for my patrons using AI to develop some fantasy concepts connected to my book, and it's a kind of funny contest. So hopefully there'll be lots more to do. There's a whole fan art section where the fans are showing off their art to each other. So please come join us on Patreon. That's the place too.
Celia continues working and publishing with all the vigor and creativity that fueled her most enduring works to date. Her works have been translated into German, French, Italian, Dutch, Russian, and Polish. Her website shows not just her upcoming novels, some of them serving as the prequels and sequels that fans have begged for since the 90s, but also the outpouring of art across the diversity of domains and mediums she's worked within beyond writing novels. She's done the impossible. She's pioneered space for all women in sci-fi fantasy fiction. She's done just as much to expand the representation for queer trans people like me, who don't fit into the classic canon of gender, orientation, and identity.
Now, if you can't leverage that into fan status for having heard that, knowing what it's about out there in the real world, I don't know what's going on.
Thank you for spending a few moments of your time with us celebrating the life and works of T.S. Friedman. You can send suggestions to transfer2soapbox@gmail.com for who you want us to cover next. Hit that subscribe button, leave a comment, or just make your own podcast. At the end of the day, I'm just glad you're here. I hope something good happens for all of you today. From me and my dog, Sydney. Bye-bye for now. Bye. 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 We'll be back soon. Don't worry. Bye. 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 Bye.